This is Mai Kue, and you are listening to The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. This is a podcast that is dedicated to stories and tellings of my spiritual experiences. Some of the stories I will be sharing will cover many topics such as the parallels in spirituality and mental health, ghost stories, dreams, tarot reading, mediumship, and more. I do want to provide a disclaimer that these are all just based on my personal experiences. I do not have any certification in spiritual healing or mental health therapy, nor do I have an altar to practice Hmong shamanistic healing or rituals. Many of the stories I will be sharing are based purely on my personal experiences and how I have made sense of them throughout the years. So to those who are listening to this podcast, I hope that you will enjoy my stories and join me on the narrow path in the floating mountains.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry, girl, you just don't make me feel right. I never meant to make you cry, you were right. Just leave me be, I'm not gonna put up a fight.
For today's episode, as I mentioned in the last episode, I will be talking about the different spiritual gifts that one can have. I will go through the different clairs, that's clairs and as in CLAIRS, and the difference between mediumship and psychic skills, or gifts, however you may call them. As always, I will be sharing from my personal experiences, and the way you come to your gifts and receive spiritual messages will be different from mine, so keep that in mind. However, I share my personal experiences because maybe some of you who are listening may resonate with the things that I share. So, first things first, I will begin by talking about psychic and mediumship skills. What is the difference? Some of us, maybe if we're not familiar with spirituality or even spiritual gifts, it might not even seem like there's a difference, but there is a very vast difference in mediumship and psychic skills. When I took the psychic workshop a few years ago, I wasn't aware of the difference either, but I learned that the main difference is who you connect or channel with to receive spiritual messages. To be honest, everyone has probably had an experience, both psychically and mediumship-wise. But it's kind of good to be able to differentiate when you are receiving one or the other, because then you're able to kind of silo off that channel to maintain a clearer pathway for this spiritual message to come through. When you are receiving a psychic message, it will often come from connecting to the energy and emotional aspect of the person who you are around, and this would have to be a person who is living. You may feel the aura or energy of the person that can trigger those messages to be channeled to you, and sometimes it's not necessarily a person, but even the space, the energy in the space. With psychic gifts, you are also connecting with your spirit guides. Spirit guides being the entities, the spiritual entities that send you messages in the form of various methods. And I will talk about the various methods a little bit later on. Most importantly, psychic gifts are channeled through the energy of a person. And I also forgot to mention, sometimes you may even be receiving messages from a person where you get a glimpse of one of their memories with other people, or something that they just remember specifically to themselves. For example, you may even receive a message that involves a person you are in the energetic field of, and see a conversation that person had with another person who is not present. So it comes from channeling their memory. That's the only way that I can explain it. That's how I've been able to differentiate between receiving psychic messages from people versus spirit guides. And one way or another, too, spirit guides kind of feed you that information to let you know. One way to explain this visual, when I do receive messages from that person, is the scene where Harry Potter sees Dumbledore's memories in the pensive. That's an aspect of psychic gifts. Now, for mediumship skills, you are essentially receiving messages from a person who has passed and are on the other side being the spiritual world. They may appear in your dreams, again in a vision, or if you are looking at a picture of them, it can appear as hearing their voice, delivering a message. It can look a multitude of ways. Sometimes it can also appear as loved ones from the other side that communicate through your spirit guides, or the loved one of people you are around standing in the corner of the room making their presence known. How do you know that it's someone who could be connected to that person? Sometimes you don't. You just kind of have to play the guessing game if that person is open to receiving it. I will also talk a little bit more about like the ethics in receiving messages or reading people, but to kind of introduce like what this gift can potentially manifest as. Sometimes it is just that, like, you just feel the energy of someone, or you can see it in your third eye of someone who's just kind of like following the person in or sitting in the room, and their energy is not threatening. They're not appearing to you in like a scary form, but they're just kind of there, and they just want to make themselves known to you. Essentially, psychic gifts are mostly channeled energetically and emotionally, whereas mediumship gifts or skills are channeled through loved ones or people who have passed and are on the other side. Mediumship skills too, you can also channel it through other means of like psychic abilities too, or psychic skills, but mostly it's communicating with people who have passed. Another thing to note is that some people may be able to channel their psychic skills more effectively than their mediumship skills, and vice versa. Some people can only channel messages through one skill. For me, I am able to channel both. However, I'm mostly connected to my psychic gifts, and it just occurs more naturally and effectively for me. Whereas my mediumship skills only kick in when it's being called to do so. Oftentimes I tell people how I experience mediumship messages. It's similar to how Patricia Arquette's character in the TV show Medium is like. I receive them through dreams, and I know it's based on a medium, like a real medium. However, how the TV depicts her visions is more in line with my personal experiences in dreams, mostly. There are ways to learn how to switch them on, your spiritual gifts on and off, but because I don't use them on a daily basis, I don't typically need to work on channeling clear messages. Whenever I'm like called to do so, they occur. So this is pretty much the difference between both terms or methods of receiving spiritual messages. Next, I want to talk more in depth about the different skills within these two channels. I also want to share that if you are trying to develop your skills, to do so ethically and cautiously. And what I mean by that is that you should never try to read into people who has not asked for your consent. And sometimes some people may be vulnerable energetically, and their spiritual barrier is thin, where you may feel their energy by receiving those messages just out of the blue. But even if you're receiving those messages, they may not be ready to receive the message. Everyone is different. Some people might not even want to be connected spiritually to people who've passed. But, those loved ones are just kind of showing up. Additionally, it should be known that sometimes it's for your personal protection, spiritually and energetically as well, because you don't want to go and invite energy or invite something in that you're not prepared to take on. I did that mistake once where someone was asking how to interpret their dreams. And for me, because I have a certain way to interpret dreams, I was trying to help her interpret her dreams. And so it was in an open forum. So she was open with what she was sharing, and it was open to anyone who could help her interpret it. And so I was like, oh, dream interpretation is not that bad. I'm just interpreting the dream. And so she also said that if anyone can interpret it for her, to message her. And so I did so. And it kind of I went down a rabbit hole that I probably shouldn't have, because then she started unloading a lot of things that she was dealing with. So on the one hand, it was like just a general like dream interpretation, and also she wanted confirmation on an image that her and her husband had channeled, but just wanted someone else's confirmation. And so I offered that too, because it was an open forum, and I was like, okay, it's not anything too deep. I'm just saying to her, like, this interpretation of whatever picture that she was wanting interpretations for was, something that I typically do anyways. And so I did that, and she started unloading a lot more things that were not connected to even the picture or the dream. She was sharing with me a lot of really deep things, and to me, as she was telling me these things, it was also very spiritual stuff. As she was telling me these things, like, I was seeing like everything happen. Like, she was just feeding so much information to me that I could feel what she was feeling. And this was just all through text, right? All through text. That I could hear her voice. I could hear exactly like how the person who she knew had passed. I could hear this person like speaking. I could hear the example, or not the example. I could hear the what was it, like the experience that she was explaining to me, from things that were dreams all the way down to like paranormal experiences. So I was even like hearing and seeing that, and I was also getting the sense that she was in a place where she was trying to figure all of these things out, and it was just kind of like hitting her like a ton of bricks. And so me not being prepared for that, I started taking on her emotions, and I wasn't even prepared to protect myself energetically. I was just like, okay, this is on like this forum, and there was nothing much to it, right? So anyways, on a side note, if people say that words don't hurt you, they do. They do. There is energy to words, right? So anyways, as she was like sharing and unloading all of these things to me, I just started like absorbing some of that unknowingly, and also seeing everything that she was telling me. I was also seeing things from the spiritual side that she was also sharing with me that she didn't know what's going on, but like I knew what was going on. And so because I knew that she was dealing with a lot of deep-rooted issues for one, she was dealing with heavy grief and shame that it was kind of like opening up the door, and I don't think that she knew like she was even dealing with these two things. And if I were to tell her like what they were, then she probably wouldn't be able to handle it, right? And so I ended up just asking her, like, have you thought about what was it, like grief therapy or grief counseling? That's what it was. I asked her if she had thought about grief counseling, and that was just something that I actually just recently found out that, you know, there were some practitioners, like mental health practitioners, who focus specifically on grief. And so I mentioned that to her, and I told her that she didn't need to share anymore with me, that I knew, and that, you know, I think it's best that she sought grief counseling as someone who is just listening to her story, not someone who has a special background in anything. I just kind of offered that like suggestion. And it really like messed me up for the next 3 days. I couldn't imagine like what she was dealing with, but I also felt that because I was dealing with my own things, that I wouldn't be the person to support her or help her navigate whatever it is that she was dealing with. And so it took me a few days to recover from that too, because I was just feeling everything that she was sharing with me, that eventually it just kind of, I just left it off at that. And I ended up apologizing to her for, you know, if I said anything that offended her or anything that made her feel like her experience wasn't validated. Because I think that was the one thing too, that she was also seeking validation for all the stuff that she was dealing with. And it sounded like no one was listening to her, or that she was kind of dealing with this alone. So I felt really bad for her, but I knew like I just wouldn't be the person to be able to support her, because I was just a stranger, and I didn't want to keep leading her on. I think there was also a sense of like dependency, like codependency, and that was something that I didn't want her to be dependent on, was to depend on someone to validate her, and so also depend on someone to like give her answers to what she was dealing with. I think at that time too, I felt like she was in a place where she had to figure those things out. But you know, who am I to like assume like what she needs and she doesn't need? I think at that time I was just trying to figure my stuff out, and I was like, you know, maybe this isn't the way. Like that was like the one time I decided to be a part of a forum that talked about spirituality and paranormal things and dream interpretation. And mostly a lot of people talked about their paranormal experiences, but there wasn't a lot of discussion on how to utilize spirituality to help them feel more empowered to do some self-healing. And so I felt like those forums were more so for just talking about these things and trying to understand them, and you know, just I think it was more, I felt like those forums were more for entertainment rather than like, how can I listen to this without how can I like watch this, or not watch it, read these things without like feeling too attached to the stories or this forum as like a resolution to whatever it was that I was dealing, if that makes sense. So I ended up like stepping away from doing anything that had to do with connecting with other people who are having like these experiences, and so I became a hermit. And then I figured everything out on my own anyways, because really I was using those forums to find answers to whatever it was that I was dealing with. Very much like the girl who was looking for help to interpret dreams and interpret things. But I felt like I just couldn't. I had to be realistic with how much I can take on energetically, emotionally, and spiritually. That I was just like, yep, this is the one time where you just need to stay in your lane. And sometimes staying in your lane is the best thing that you can do in terms of like utilizing your spiritual gifts, right? Like, don't go around offering it to people and not knowing like what you got yourself into. You know, if there's also a saying in the Hmong community about like, when someone needs your help, then they will come to you. It would either be by chance of fate or that they know who you are and they will call upon your help. And that as the healer, you shouldn't go asking for people. You shouldn't be offering it. And a lot of that had been happening in the spiritual community online too, where people were getting unsolicited offers to do readings for them. And so these people were like reading into other people's energy so that they can provide like spiritual services. And then when they rope that person in, they would force them to, well, I shouldn't say force. They would persuade them to pay them for the service that they had already provided by just doing the reading. But it's still kind of going on. A lot of people are still like scamming people. I have no doubt that they can do whatever it is that they can do. But it's just one of those things where people can be really good at what they do, but use it to manipulate and take advantage of others, right? So anyways, that's where I decided, like, you know, how to be very selective with who I help and I offer like suggestions or anything, resources. Yeah, so that's why you don't want to go randomly like reading someone and then trying to tell them like what's going on, because some people might not even be ready. You know, some people might not even be ready. And the hardest part is that even if you are channeling a message that it has like life or death consequences or results, that it shouldn't be like provoked, if that makes sense. And right now I'm getting like the whole Eternals movie, because that's kind of what it was. Like, they knew that the earth was bound to die, and so there were a few people who were like, no, just let it keep happening, because then other galaxies can be created. But then these other Eternals, they were like, no, we've developed a relationship with these people, we really care for them, we want to keep them alive. And so it's kind of like that, right? But I do feel that for most people who have these spiritual gifts, like, they're never receiving gifts about who's gonna pass and who's gonna stay alive. You know, I kind of feel like that happens on a very rare occasion. But I'm saying this as I have talked about my dreams. But I really feel that, you know, for me, I don't go soliciting messages or readings, because sometimes, like, I do get them wrong too. So I always try to come from a place of humility and being realistic, and just trying not to feel like I am always right? Like, all the visions I'm seeing is right. Because sometimes really how visions and messages appear to you is it's in bits and pieces, like a puzzle, and you're just left to try and figure it out before it really happens. That's my take on it anyways. So anyways, with that said, I want to go in and talk about the different clairs, because I think it is very important to understand the different clairs. That's clairs as in CLAIRS, These are the different types of spiritual gifts. The ones that I will mention are just the ones that are most widely known, but apparently there's like so many out there right now. But the few that I will mention are the ones that people most typically experience, but also kind of like the main ones that help branch out into these other like types of clairs. So the first one is clairvoyance. Most of us already know what that is, and it's essentially clear seeing, like seeing clearly. You receive visual messages or visions by way of seeing like images or pictures of things or symbols that can be similar to visions when you are envisioning a story. So when I talk about symbols too, I'm not thinking about like abstract symbols. I'm thinking about like, you know, you see a random apple and you're like, okay, why did I just think about an apple? And it could be your spirit guides telling you apple relating to this person, or relating to like horse, because horse and apple, and that, you know, then you're thinking, and then the horse becomes a symbol in itself, like horse spirit guide. And then what is this horse spirit guide trying to tell you? It's trying to tell you to just go with the flow, and you'll be free, you'll be set free, or, you know, going with whatever you're gonna be handed, you know. Or maybe like you're feeling like you're in a race and you are falling behind or something, and that you need to pick up the pace, whatever that could be, right? So symbols like that, so things, objects can be considered symbols. One way to receive clairvoyant messages, which is visions, what we typically associate with mediumship and psychic skills, is this particular gift, seeing visions. And they're not like how it's portrayed on Charmed or on the first series anyways. It's not perceived like that. I feel like I don't experience it like that. And then also with like Ghost Whisper, I feel like I don't experience it like that either, where you just all of a sudden like stop and you're like, I have a vision, you know? Like what's that one vampire? There was that vampire in Twilight that had visions like that. You know, like you don't just stop and then like it hits you. Some people may experience some messages like that, but for me, like I don't get them like that. It just kind of appears like a random thought, and then I'm thinking like, okay, why did I just think about this? You know, I don't know if I shared this in the last episode, but an example of a clairvoyant message for me is I've had this happen to me multiple times, and this is the only reason how I know that this was a clairvoyant message, and that a specific image represented a certain outcome, was because it was happening like frequently. And so for me, I would have if I was driving, right? If I was driving just anywhere around town or anywhere, and I get this sudden vision or this sudden thought of me just hitting a person or hitting someone crossing the street, I would be alert, right? It would force me to be alert. So I was having these visions, and it would force me to be alert, only to find out that half a mile or a few blocks down would be an accident or an ambulance or something with sirens. And so this happened to me quite frequently. I don't really pay attention to it much now, but that was happening, and because then it just bugged me. I'm like, why am I so messed up? Like, why do I keep having these visions of hitting people? Like, I don't want to have these visions, and it would be like really gruesome visions. And so I started realizing like, oh, I'm getting these visions for a reason, and it's in a way my guides telling me like, hey, just be careful, this is up ahead, you know. And it would only be specifically when I was driving. And so I remember someone mentioning, someone who also has a channel where they talk about spiritual stuff, that she was saying that her spirit guides are a little extra, and they show her like visions that are very like dramatic or very intense. And I realized, like, I'm like, oh yeah, that happens to me too. Like with this specifically, was that my guides would show me these really horrific visions to bring it to my attention. Because, you know, having a vision of you hitting someone versus like an apple, like which one are you going to react most to, right? Which one is going to make you feel something more to where you'll be more alert, right? And so that's an example of a clairvoyant vision, or one that I can come back to and speak about it in waking anyway. So a lot of these clairs, they take place when you're awake, and you're just hanging out, and you know, you experience these things, or maybe like you're going out and you experience these things. But when I talk about these gifts, it's typically when you are awake. The next thing is clairaudience, and that is clear hearing. So hearing clearly. And it could be like when you hear messages or even voices as if they are stuck in a void, like in between. Like it's not like how you would hear someone talking to you like one-on-one, but it would be kind of like, I don't want to say it's like in your head, because there's like a stigma attached to that, right? Hearing voices in your head. But clairaudience is when you can vividly hear the voice of a person or a thing or animal without them even saying anything to you. It's like hearing the person's internal monologue. That's the only way I can explain it. Right? So like when you're watching a movie and you hear the narrator talking, but there's still something like being played on the screen. That's how that's how my clairaudience is. And I do feel that my only experience with clairaudience that I can talk about is having to do with like mediumship skills. But other times too, clairaudience can be something where you hear something and then all of a sudden like you don't hear it, or you hear it like really briefly, and then you try to like quiet down and listen to it and you can't hear it anymore, or you're just getting the sense that it's kind of still there, but it's like an echo. I don't know how to explain it, but sometimes for me, it's most active during a state of being asleep and awake. So I believe what this is like the liminal state, when you're in between sleep and being awake. So the example of that I can share about clairaudience was when, again, I took the Psychic 101 class, and we were instructed to just do a photo reading of a person. The instructor, she didn't give us any background information. It wasn't anyone that we knew. It wasn't anyone in the room. We were all strangers. There was maybe 3 people who knew each other and knew the instructor, but me and the other 2 students, we didn't know anyone at all. So all of this information was just new to us. And so we were instructed to do a photo reading where you just look at the photo of a person. It could be a selfie, or it could be like a picture of someone at like Six Flags or whatever, right? Just a picture of a person. And we were just to write down all the things we were picking up from it, down to like, okay, the hat she's wearing, it's like a Cubs hat, you know, there's something in the back with like banners and things. And so I was just kind of writing down the things that I was picking up, and just thinking like, okay, who's this person, like, who are you? And I started writing down just things, in a way like guessing, but like picking the first response that you get, right? The first response that you get. And next thing I know, I start hearing her voice, the voice of this person, right? I started hearing her voice. Her voice was raspy, and then I started picking up more things about her, like her illness, her ailment, maybe what she had passed from or what she had been dealing with. I picked up cancer, I picked up sun, I picked up college, I picked up like all these other things, and then I just kind of noted down, I hear her voice. And so as soon as I wrote that down, the instructor looks at me and she just kind of gives me like this look like, I know what you just wrote down, right? Like, she doesn't say anything to me, but she just kind of gives me this look. And continue writing down, and then, we were only given 10 minutes to write things down, 10 or 15 minutes. And so it was time for us to share what we had. And I went into this class not having any expectations. I was like, you know what, Mai Kue, like, you know how to do these things. You know how to do these things, but you're just trying to figure out how to refine them, right? And this is like one of those ways where you can exercise these things to kind of just see how they work. And so during this photo reading, when it was time for us to share, everyone was sharing. I think everyone was also very unsure about if they got things right, but I was just like, you know what, I'm probably gonna get this wrong, but I'm not gonna care. I'm just gonna read off what I wrote down, right? Because there were so many of us, I could have been picking up something from someone else too, not specific to the photo. And so I already knew that going in. So as I'm sharing, and then I say, oh, and it was really crazy. I could hear her voice. She had a very raspy voice. And so then as soon as I said I can hear her, the instructor got really excited, and she kind of like clapped her hands. She's like, I knew someone heard her. And so it was interesting because maybe the person we were reading also told her like, oh, someone can hear me. And so as I was sharing, finally, or we got done sharing, and then she tells us who this person is. And this person was someone who she considered an older sister, and that she has 2 sons, and that this person was working in TSA for a long, long time, and that she was one of the first people to be affected by the radiation of the scanners, and that she had suffered like cancer, and that she was losing her hair, and she was a long-time smoker but ended up quitting smoking due to her illness, and that her son was gonna go to college but things fell through, and that when she got sick, like, he stayed. Well, I think it ended up where he was supposed to go to college, but then he got into heavy drugs. It was something like that halted his college path. But she was sharing all of this, and like, we didn't even know if this person was deceased or not. But then she tells us the person was deceased, and I just kind of like patted myself on the back, like, okay, like, you can do this, and so that was a clear experience of like example of clear audience, is that like I wasn't hearing it in the space, but as I was looking at her picture, I even saw her mouth start moving, but it was just still, right? But I was like seeing it as if it was a cinematic movie, or kind of like, how there's these apps now where they can make paintings look like they're moving or they're alive because they superimpose it to like someone moving, and they can make it look like that. Well, that's what was happening, except for the instructor did not have that filter on. It was just a projection of a picture of her, like a webcam photo of her, and that was pretty much it. But I could hear her voice, and I could just hear her like talking. It was almost like she was talking to like her son, or talking to our instructor. She wasn't talking to me, but she was talking. So that was an example. And then later on that day, another like added to this experience, later on that day, it was her son that called the instructor, because the instructor was still pretty close to her friend's son, and so he called and he just wanted to know like what was going on. And very interesting, like she never made it a point to like play favoritism, the instructor, because she wanted to be equal for everyone, and also like just to help people stay humble about what they do, because that was the main thing too, is that you don't ever want to boast that you know how to do all these things, right? Because it all came down to like still following your spiritual path and getting rid of the ego. That was something that we talked about too, getting rid of the ego and trying to get the right answer. And so she never was one to like play favoritism. And I only had one class with her, but she was really awesome. And so yeah, I got a lot from this class. So it was just kind of like reassuring, and it was fun. I took it as like, this is fun, I'm gonna enjoy this, try not to have any expectations from it. But that's an example of clairaudience. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into the next one. Clairsentience, clear feeling things clearly, is when you feel sensations in your body from using your either psychic or medium skills. It could be that someone who has passed from something having to do with a head injury or something, and then you start having a headache, or someone who, when you're doing things psychically, that you could be feeling someone's stomach ache. A lot of that happens actually when someone else is having a stomach ache and all of a sudden you start having a stomach ache. That's an example of clairsentience through the psychic channel. Again, this could be the pain of others or the spirit you are in contact with. Sometimes they can also be emotions, but feeling someone else's emotions that is not yours has also been identified as another type of clair. So that is the one. I'm going to talk about that later too, but just kind of want to get out there. So clairsentience is like the physical feeling of some energy or some other person or some other spirit that you're communicating with. So this doesn't necessarily have to be like a spirit. This could even be like your friend. Like all of a sudden you start getting cramps. You're like, damn, why am I getting cramps? And then your friend says, oh man, like yesterday I went running and today I'm like having cramps all day, It could be something like that. So clairsentience. The next thing is claircognizance. This one's a little interesting, but also tricky to try and use. It's clear knowing, so knowing clearly. And it's not anything where you're like understanding or grasping a concept really well or what's going on really well. Claircognizance is just that you just know. It's a lot of people say like, when you just know, or you just have a feeling. That's an aspect of claircognizance. It can be defined as when you are having the experience of suddenly just knowing, right? Like someone is going to they're going somewhere, they're traveling out of the country, and they haven't shared it with anyone, but then you just know, you're like, oh, they're traveling out of the country because they're meeting someone. But they're not sharing that with you, but then you pick up on that, right? And you just know, like, oh, and it's something that's completely out of their character. And so that's an example of claircognizance. And I have had maybe a few experiences with this, but it's a little bit hard because sometimes once I receive a message about just knowing some information, that all of a sudden everything else that ties into it comes together, and then that's how it happens for me. So some information would just pop up that I didn't have any like preconceived notions about or any like pre-knowledge about, and then once it comes to me, everything else starts coming together to be a part of like this information that I just like I see everything else that affected, that came into play to create this information that I'm now receiving, if that makes sense. It's a little hard to explain, but for me that's why it's tricky. Again, it's just the type of gift where you, for some reason you just know the information. No one told you, you didn't find it anywhere, you didn't force yourself to find anything, you just know. It can be triggered by just some of the things that you are picking up from all the other skills too. Like say you're picking up some clairvoyance messages, you're picking up on clairaudience, you're picking up on clairsentience, that triggers this information too. This information that you're receiving through like claircognizance. So you are receiving it randomly and almost like an epiphany. And it can appear as a stroke of insight or download, and can also manifest as instincts, like you just know what to do, right? So I wanted to say something about like an epiphany, and I lost it. The exact opposite of claircognizance is when you forget, right? Yeah, so a stroke of insight or a download, like you just have an epiphany. So that's claircognizance. The other thing is, so I also wanted to add that with claircognizance, it's also what most people think of psychic gifts or fortune telling. It's that most people just think like you should know these things without any like preconceived knowledge. I think that's a misconception too. Like you don't just suddenly know that someone is going to pass, or you don't just suddenly know that someone is going to win the lottery. I think a lot of times it happens by way of the person you are in contact with, that they're about to make a decision and you see that decision, or you just receive information about someone. Like that's my experience anyways. It could be that, but that's just my experience with claircognizance. So the expectation that a psychic or a medium should just know, right? That's like a stereotype that it can be assumed about claircognizance, is that, well, you're a psychic, you should just know. Or, you know, even if a psychic or a medium gets something wrong, that they're expected to, like, they're not real or they're fake. But the truth is that you just can't possibly be seeing everything or seeing what someone's fate is, or you can't possibly just know everyone's information. Like it's almost as though, you know, one way is that someone can't just possibly be hearing like so many conversations going on at the same time towards them. That's just nearly impossible. We're only here to be able to focus on one thing at a time. So, an example of claircognizance is not particularly with me, but there was someone who sells plants here where I live, and they have a little shop in this flea market south of the city that I live in. And him and his wife, they have the gift of seeing or receiving messages, and so they sell like plants that help bring in prosperity and fortune to your family. And so it was me and my sister-in-law. We went there because I just wanted to go, and it was because like this guy, he had given me and my husband a really great like astrology reading, and he was telling us how My husband, he's born year of the monkey, I'm born year of the tiger, and those two are complete opposites. But somehow, he was explaining to us that somehow, like, it works because of the signs that your parents are born in, and so you carry some of your parents' traits. And so, astrological traits anyways. And so he was explaining that to us, and I was like, oh, maybe like it'll be cool to just kind of check out like what he's doing, or you know, if there's any plants, because I wanted to go back to his little shop to get like a money plant. And so we went there, and he was sharing a lot of information to my sister-in-law, and I really didn't mind because he was saying that him and his wife, they both have similar gifts, but they do things differently. And so he was talking to us and stuff, and then he kind of just looked at me. He looked at me and didn't say much. He didn't have a lot to share with me this time. But he looked at me and he said, you know, you should be very careful with how you drive. You should be very careful, especially with speeding. Be very careful. And so I just kind of giggled and laughed, because I'm like, well, I've never had that issue before, you know, like driving fast on the highway or anything. But he just basically told me to just be careful. And it could even be that he didn't see the actual event, but he may have been receiving signs, or he may have been receiving messages from his guides that were showing him like symbols and signs of like warning and being careful. And so maybe he was having the same type of visions that I would have, of like really horrific scenes, but it would equate to the actual thing that happened would just be something not as severe, but just still to keep cautious. And so a few months after that, I would say like a month or two after getting this reading, that as I was coming back from out of town from a training that was taking place out of town, as I was coming back to my house, as I was driving back home, I had my music playing, and I was just like so into my music. I wasn't paying attention to my speedometer, and I thought that the car that was in the center median, was a van that was trying to do a U-turn. And so little did I know it was the sheriff, and they were what is it called? They were checking people's speed, right? And I didn't know that I was going 10 over, but I was like I think I did more. It's kind of embarrassing. I was definitely over the speed limit by a lot. And they pulled me over, and I was like freaking out. I'm like, oh my god, I freaking knew it. I saw them. I thought it was a van, and it wasn't. And you know, I pulled over to the left hand side, and they were like scolding me, telling me, oh, you know, you should have pulled over to the right because this is a hazard. I'm like, oh, well, I've never been pulled over before, so I don't know. I didn't know. And so then they asked me, I think they were kind of checking my license plate too, and they were asking me like, do I know like why they pulled me over? I'm like, no. And they were like, was there a reason for me to speed? I'm like, no, I just wasn't paying attention, you know. And so they ended up telling me that I was going over the speed limit, and that, you know, they're giving me a citation, and that I can dispute it and whatever. But I ended up paying it because I really didn't have a reason to dispute it. I was just not paying attention. It was like a human error. And I remembered, I think it was when I came back home and I talked about it with my husband, that it brought me back to the reading that the man at the shop had shared with me. And I was just like, oh my god, like this shit is real. This was before I took the Psychic 101 class. But it was just one of those things that was just kind of like, oh my god, like this is a freaking real deal. But an example That's an example of clear cognizance, like just knowing. So moving on, the next clear and the final clear that I want to talk about is clear empathy. Clear empathy is when you can feel the emotions of others. And I gave that example when I was talking about clear sentience. But this is specifically talking about emotions, thoughts, and how they manifest and what are the symptoms. I think it's very important to know the symptoms to this particular clear, because sometimes it's so hard to draw the line between emotions, like what is yours and what isn't. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this. It's also because I do believe that everyone who is on a spiritual journey of healing, either spiritually or emotionally, that many of us experience clear empathy. There's a really great book out there. I think I mentioned this in the first episode, called the Empath Survival Guide, unless I referred it to a client. But it's a really great book that gives you tips on how to process your emotions when you are around people, or you're in an environment that's highly emotionally charging, or when you find yourself feeling anxious. What are some things that you can do to de-escalate like this anxiety that you're experiencing? I had a copy, but then I ended up giving it away, and I kind of wish I still had it. But a lot of things that I read or took from the book were things that I had already been practicing through my personal journey of healing, like emotionally. And so in a way, it kind of makes sense. Like the science part and the spiritual part was already making sense to me. And so yeah, I highly recommend that book. But with clear empathy, it is an awareness of emotional energy. And some of us, we already have this, but some may feel emotions more intensely than others, although it doesn't mean one is better than the other. Some people are really good at like shutting off the emotional energy of others, and then for example me, I just can't, I try really hard to create a barrier or a force field, but I also tend to feel that even within that, I'm still like feeling things from people. So being a clear empath too, like that saying, like people make excuses for how, or no, I shouldn't say that, because that's very problematic. Not making excuses. Some people use this phrase to describe themselves as highly sensitive. They often say like it's because they're an empath, and usually when I hear people say that, it's them kind of telling people that they're very sensitive to certain spaces or around certain people. But I do feel that many of us can experience clear empathy, some more so than others. Some do a really great job of protecting their emotional field. And then for some who are like me, it's just really hard to do that. I think it has to do with like building stamina to be able to ward off other energies, emotional energies too. I, for one, wasn't really taught that growing up, so now as an adult, I'm trying to figure out how to do that. Not necessarily taking on anyone's emotions, but also knowing how to navigate spaces, but also other things like deflecting like emotions when they're projecting onto you, or knowing how to process when someone is projecting to you, that you can pick and choose if you want to if you want to be able to help this person process it, or if you're not ready to, then what are things you can do? So it is important for clear empathic people to know and understand how to protect their aura or energy when they enter a highly charged space. And actually, now that I think about it, I do it pretty well now. It depends on the day though, because anyone can have a really funky day and they just don't have the energy to deal with negative people. They don't have the energy to keep up with certain highly energetic people. I think it really just depends on the day. But for those who are easily impacted by the emotions of others and different types of spaces, I think you do what you can, because I remember a time when that was hard for me too, and I just needed a really long time to be by myself before I can reintroduce myself into society. But I think that you do what you can. Some of us, we are just more highly empathic than others. I think empathy is good. Not a lot of empathy is not bad, because some of us, that's just how we are conditioned. And then for some of us who struggle with even feeling empathy or feeling the emotions of others, I think that I don't know how to speak to that, because I haven't had that experience. But there are ways to channel that too. I think it's like physical cues or social cues, and coming from a place of understanding, or understanding like what that person might be feeling, because many of us, we've experienced different types of emotions and we know what they feel like during certain situations, and so using that to navigate social spaces that where you are going to be required to know how to like socialize based on the emotions of others, or even your emotional like field. So while clear empathy is very similar to clairsentience, the difference is that empaths sense emotion that are not theirs, and sentiences sense physical pain. So you're not just one or the other. You could also be experiencing like clear empathy or clear sentience at the same time, or clairvoyance and clear empathy at the same time. So again, an example that I want to share about my experience with clear empathy was a time when I went to New York. It was for a business trip, work trip. I shouldn't say business, because it wasn't business at all. It was work. That me and the two other people that I went there with, we decided on our time off to go to Central Park. And we went to Central Park, and I thought it was just me feeling like I was being isolated or ostracized, or that they were just being jerks. I think it was partially that triggered it, but I often felt that I could be that I was strong enough to like deal with people's jerkiness. And so we were walking, and something just like triggered me, where I hit this wall of panic. I was having a full-blown, like, I shouldn't say panic, anxiety attack in the middle of Central Park. And I thought it was because like I felt that these people were just being really mean and rude to me, and that I couldn't be there. Like, I had to go, I had to leave. And so I walked away without even telling them. I walked away. I called my husband, and I just started like crying. I started hyperventilating. I started like just full-blown crying in the middle of Central Park. And he's trying to console me, and I told him I'm going back to the hotel room. I don't care. I just want to be alone. And so I texted both of them that I was going to walk back to the hotel by myself because I wasn't feeling good. And I wish that I was just left alone. I think in that certain situation too, I wish I would have just, we all shared a room, and that was like totally my mistake. I should have just gotten my own room. But I didn't know that that was an option because I had never gone on a work trip before, so I didn't know like if we were supposed to stay together or it was okay for us to stay apart or what that looked like, right? And so I was thinking that I just need to go away, and I was gonna go back to the hotel room. And so we tried talking about it, and I couldn't even figure out why or what my reason was. But when I came back, I was able to like make sense. I had more sense of a clarity about everything that had happened, and I felt really bad afterwards because I couldn't even pinpoint like what it was. All I could say was that I felt like I was being ostracized and that they were being jerks, and I couldn't even put my finger on why they were being jerks. And it could have just been that, I waited. I wanted to go somewhere, but then they kept saying, oh, let's go here first. Let's go here. Let's go here. And so I just waited and waited and waited. And I was just trying to be nice. And something triggered it, and I just like fell apart. And so after that, I went to the hotel, and they asked if I wanted to go out with them. I was like, no, I don't want to go out. I really just want to stay in. And they tried really hard to have me go out with them because they didn't want me to feel left out, but I just kept telling them like, no, I just really need time to myself. And I ended up doing that. And like maybe a year or two later, I realized I'm like, wow, I really couldn't even pinpoint what it was. Like there was no animosity towards them. It wasn't anything that led up to it. I was just not sure where this came from. And so I checked it up to, I might have walked into somebody's emotional bubble or walked up to a very highly emotionally charged like space in Central Park. There's a lot of things that happen in Central Park. There's a lot of trauma that happens there, not just like with modern day crime, but there was a whole ass village in Central Park that was demolished, and people were forced to move out and lost their houses because Central Park was being built. And so there's a lot of people who's reported on this village. I think it was called Seneca Village. I believe that's what it was called. But it was a village that used to be in Central Park, but what people there were forced out, and they ended up losing their homes, and actually I think there was a lot more than that. And so I checked it up to that, and I think where I hit that wall of emotion, or I just all of a sudden like was overwhelmed with that, was around that area. It was around that area. I think it was around the Strawberry Fields area, actually. Because I remember us going through that long walkway. I forget, it was like I don't want to call it a boardwalk, but that long like aisle of trees and benches. And I forget what part of that Central Park is, but we had just walked past that, and then we were walking further away from the center of the park. And as I thought about it, I was like, now in hindsight, I'm like, I probably walked into that. because some people can still feel residual energy or emotions of the past. And yeah, so anyways, that is an example. That is the only example I can give, prominent example of I can give of like clear empathy. Again, there are other clears to be noted, but I feel the first few I mentioned are the most important to know. I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about shaman gifts in here, but I feel that it's not within my expertise to talk about it. Originally, I had it as a part of this episode, but I think I'm going to save it for another episode. And again, I don't want to talk about something that I'm not an expert at, so I know I didn't mention it at the beginning of this episode, but I'm looking at my bullet points, and that was something that came across to me, and I was like, probably not an area of expertise for me to talk about. But this is pretty much it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed my stories as well as my explanation of the different gifts. If you want to learn more about how to channel these, I may do another episode on this. There might be an episode down the line about this workshop that I had, or how to like channel them, or what you can do to refine these gifts a little bit more, if that's something that you're interested in, or if you're just interested in hearing like my stories and how I explored using them, both the safe way and the, I don't want to say them unsafe way, ways that I just kind of knew what to do. There wasn't so much of like a repercussion to it, because it was all done by like things that I wanted to do are never things that are like going to have a bad result, or where the consequences are going to be like really heavy consequences, but just kind of like my trial and errors. Let's call it that, trial and errors with like reading and things, or like trying out your skills, because I like to hear how people try out certain things too, and how they make sense of things. There's a whole other part of my spiritual journey that delves into even connecting with different star systems, like entities from different star systems. I know for some people that's just gonna go right over their head, but that goes more into like the like deep part of spiritual journeys that some people may be turned off by it, but you know, who knows, that might be something that I talk about in the near future too. But again, this is it for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you tune in to the next episode. And that concludes this episode of The Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tune in for the next one coming out soon.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry.